So we all have different ways of dealing with conflictual situations. We all have different personality styles, and we all have different defaults for the way in which we like to deal with issues that come up in the workplace and other places with regards to conflict. In this unit, however, what we want to begin looking at is how can we improve the way in which we deal with conflict for the betterment of our teams, our organizations, our workplaces, as leaders within those communities. So for us, it's important to begin looking at what we mean when we talk about conflict management. How do we deal with those conflicts that occur in a professional place? From a non-theological starting point, I suppose, we need to say that when it comes to conflict, there is always an egocentric aspect to it. That is, we believe that we're right. I mean, if not, there wouldn't be any conflict, right? When we engage with somebody else, it's important for us to try and engage with an open mind. That is not to say that we compromise, it's not to say that we give in, especially perhaps on spiritual issues where we have very strong opinions. But we should learn to try to understand where they're coming from. And so to help us with that, there's some principles that I want us to keep in mind. And as I said in the introductory video, these principles come by and large from a very good book called Crucial Conversations. In this particular book, the authors talk about how you can begin to think through the process of engaging with conflict with people before, during, and after. And they give us some principles which I think if we can keep in our minds, perhaps even memorize the acronyms for, they can actually help us in these situations. I know that personally for me, I have benefited from some of these principles. Crucial Conversations is essentially a way of recognizing your own patterns in conflict situations and how to get to the essence of the conflict so that you can begin to deal with it. Many times the real issue is not dealt with in a very constructive manner because we don't diagnose it, or we allow emotion, anger, and insecurities to mask over what really needs to be done in that situation. So a crucial conversation really involves three parts. There is opposing opinions, there are strong emotions, and there are high stakes. And when you put these things together, that is combustible. And when we choose not to deal with these situations, things can only become worse. So what happens when we don't deal well with a conflict? Well, the worst case scenario is they just don't get it and you don't get it and you try to avoid each other as much as possible. The good is maybe when we recognize the problem and we just try to find a way to work around it. But the best, surely, is for us to see the problem and attempt to deal with it effectively. And the problem that many of us face is this idea of having a low relational collateral. In business, we sometimes have the advantage of leverage. So if I'm the boss and you're not, that means I get to say, if you don't do this, you're fired. That's my leverage. But no one wants to lead from that place. No one wants to use the threat of the big stick to get the job done. We should make mastering conflict resolution a must-have. In the video that you either have watched or will watch, Joseph Grenny talks about some of these principles. And he encourages people to think CPR whenever you engage with a conflict. Content, pattern, and relationship. Content is the issue. What actually has happened? You missed the deadline, okay? That's the issue. The pattern is something that is happening a lot. You didn't just miss this deadline, you missed several deadlines. That's a pattern. And then there's the relationship. Why do you care so much that they missed the deadline? What is personally going on inside of you that is making this issue much more emotional than it perhaps could be? One of the principles that they talk about in the book, which I think is very, very crucial, no pun intended, is that you need to have the right conversation. Sometimes we end up having completely the wrong conversation, and it becomes about how my feelings have been hurt, or how so-and-so didn't do what I expected them to do. And it really is about us, and it's not so much about the issue. And so, how do we get to that part? And I want to talk through some of those principles with you in this video. These are some principles of having constructive conversations, and we want to spend some time talking about those. They are quite simply: get unstuck, start with the heart, learn to look, make it safe, master my story, state my path, explore others' paths, and move to action. Now, it sounds a little complex, but once we get into it, you'll see how it works. The first thing that degrades in crucial conversations is not our behavior, but it's often our motive. Learn to stay focused on what really needs to happen to get better results. And this is where it's important for us to get unstuck and actually get to why we're having this conversation in the first place. And then to start with the heart. Here are some good questions to keep in mind. Why did you not say what you were thinking? What was at the heart of the conversation that was never spoken? And what do you think of the saying, if you don't talk it out, you act it out? These are some interesting things. Now, recall a conversation that you've had recently. An important issue, an important conversation that didn't go well. Maybe you became pushy. Maybe both of you started to fume over the issue. And think about what was said during that time. Reconstruct that conversation in your mind and jot down the gist of what was said. And then think about what was not said. What was going on in your head that you wanted to say, but you just didn't. That is the beginning of getting to the heart of the issue. Now, what is the skill here? What is the leadership principle for us to master? The first thing, and it's quite a biblical thing, is to work on me first. Why were you getting so emotional? What was going on in the conversation that caused you to respond the way you did? Admit your role in that conflict going the way it did, and attempt to re-engage as soon as possible. Don't always go for what is called the sucker's choice, which is either this or that. Either you do this or something bad's going to happen, because those are both bad alternatives. You're trying to get somebody to do something they don't want to do at the threat of you doing something else. Rarely, if ever, do those types of arrangements work very well. Then you need to learn how to look. Again, when a conversation turns crucial, we either miss or misinterpret the signs. And the sooner we notice that we're no longer in dialogue here, the sooner we can get back to it and lower the collateral damage. It's not easy, but we have to learn to look at the signs. The worst case scenario with this is that we just don't notice that things are heating up, and we failed to react to the conditions. And we walk away at the end of that saying, what happened? How did this get to this point? The good is we recognize things aren't going well, and we try to change our message ever slightly so that people avoid getting hurt. That's okay, but it's not the best. The best is to recognize and identify the issue, pull yourself out of the content, and think about articulating something in a different way. So ask yourself these questions. How do you feel when a conversation becomes crucial? What happens to you even physically? For some people, they tense up. They put their hands in their pockets. They clench their fists. They get sweaty palms. What happens to you during those times? When that starts to happen, you recognize that this conversation is taking a turn. Recognize when people move to silence or violence. Those are two polar opposites, but really stating the same thing. Either people become very quiet and they stop speaking, they disengage, they become like a wall, or they become violent, which means not physically violent, hopefully not, but they shout or they become somewhat uncontrolled. It's important for us to recognize these non-engaging responses, because when somebody is moving to silence or violence, they have stopped talking about the issue and now it's become about something else. learn to recognize your pattern, because then it gets easier to see that in others. What do? How do you respond? And when you begin to see that happening to yourself, you know that you're getting into a crucial conversation, and you can begin to detect it in others as well. So it's very important that we learn how to look. And then fourthly, let's try and find ways to make the conversation safe. You see, when things go wrong in crucial conversations, we can assume that the message is the problem. And so we can become tempted to water it down or just avoid it altogether. Think about how this works in Christian evangelism, for example. People either tend to revert to a way of sharing their faith that is more akin to somebody ramming a Bible down somebody's throat, or they back off entirely. Well, let's not talk about this. Let's not make this an issue. Let's just forget I said anything. One might be a better way to deal with this discussion than that. If you create a safe environment, then you can talk about almost anything. And this is a very important principle. Somebody once said, respect is like air. You don't know about it and think about it until it's gone. And then it's all you think about. I think that's a very important principle. Make sure that respect is always a crucial part of your conversation. And when it comes to safety, it's all about intent. Now again, the worst case scenario here is that we completely miss those signals and we just plunge ahead. We just carry on going through our message, not realizing that we have deeply hurt somebody else. The good is that we recognize some of those signals, but in order to not offend anyone, we just water down our message. But perhaps the best is for us, again, to step out of the content and rebuild the safety. Help them realize that you want what's best, they want what's best, and if that's both true for both of us, then we can find a way, build a bridge. So step out of the content, step away from the issue and say, let's figure out how we can fix our relationship. Rebuild that safety. Let them know that you really care about them and their best interests. And then, once that's been established, you can step back in. So in the next part of this video, we're going to look at the rest of the principles and give you some things to apply.